Okay, here we go. Psychology of a Paedophile. All in the Mind, ABC Radio National.
Anthony and Chrissy Foster's two daughters, Emma and Katie, were abused by their parish priest when they were in primary school. But their parents didn't find out about it until a number of years later. So tell me about, in retrospect, what were the signs?
Very, very few and far between.
Emma, she used to speak about coke making her drunk. It was something I overheard. I suppose it left a question mark there because it was strange and we never gave her coke. But I was later to find out that she'd actually been given coke by O'Donnell, the priest. He drugged this coke.
So you found out that Kevin O'Donnell was actually raping children after having drugged them with spiked Coca-Cola?
I found that out about my children.
What else have you found out about the techniques that Kevin O'Donnell used?
He was very good at spoiling certain children. He's been known to throw a handful of coins in front of a group of children outside the primary school. He had a room specially set up with a fridge with coke in it, then possibly leading on, as with Emma, to coke which was drugged. He had firearms in the presbytery that he allowed boys and possibly girls to play with. Sounds incredible, but it is the case. He let young boys drive his car. A number of grooming techniques that just gave him incredible power to access children and do what he wanted to do with them at whim.
And one of the stories that really struck me regarding his manipulation and deliberate technique was when he asked the children to go round and gather pens from filling out forms in the church, and one by one he'd take the children aside and sexually abuse them and then come out and get the other one and keep telling the children to go and get more pens.
Yes, it was quite amazing, and that really speaks of the technique of a well-practiced pedophile. That's how it works. It's so simple, just like that.
And none of the children knew that it was happening to each other.
No, that's very typical of victims. Most victims think they are the only one because so much of the success of the pedophile rests on them convincing that the victim that they are special and that they're the only one. They can be opportunistic because they have such a solid foundation of power and grooming that they seem to be able to just pick children at will, and certainly O'Donnell was like that.
Anthony and Chrissy Foster. How does Professor Stephen Smallbone's ideas about paedophilic behaviour apply to the sex abuse that's occurred in the Catholic Church community?
Well, I think one of the remarkable things about sexual abuse in organisational settings, and it's not just church communities, of course, there have been many inquiries that have uncovered all sorts of abuse of children within institutions. But I think one of the remarkable things, particularly in the church environment, is that a kind of a subculture seems to have emerged that has managed to corrupt the values of the organisation. So here in an organisation that would otherwise aspires to the highest moral standards, it becomes possible for people to develop a set of values that puts the reputation of the organisation above the value of protecting children.
What do you know about the profile of somebody who becomes a sex offender?
Well, there's enormous diversity within the group of people who have committed sexual offences against children. Most offenders are male. After that, the psychological characteristics become less clear. There's a small proportion of sex offenders who do seem, from a clinical point of view, compelled some level of obsession, spending a lot of time thinking about children, for example. But the vast majority of people who sexually abuse children, once they're caught, as far as we know, in fact, don't repeat it. That's not an outcome that you'd expect of a highly compulsive or obsessive behaviour.
So is there anything that you can generalise about in terms of sex offenders' modus operandi?
Well, yes, I think there are two kinds of circumstances in which sexual abuse tends to occur. One of them is a kind of an aggressive behaviour. The offender is simply gratifying their own urges at the complete expense of the victim involved. But there's another category which possibly is even more common, where the abuse arises from a kind of a nurturing context. We know that most sexual abuse occurs within home settings, for example. It's usually not, in fact, a biological father, but often a stepfather or an uncle or a visitor to the home or so on. But they're often involved in childcare activities with the child. This is similar to, I think, how a lot of the abuse occurs in institutional settings as well, including church organisations, where the original relationship prior to the abuse occurring is really based on an effort by the would-be offender to take a caretaking and nurturing role with respect to the child. This is not by any means behaviour that ought to be condoned, but a lot of ordinary sexual behaviour occurs in this way as well, mostly when adults are having sexual relationships with one another. They're involved in caretaking of each other and nurturing one another. So I don't think that's a big surprise. It's the context, obviously, that makes child sexual abuse different.
Stephen Smallbone. So is there a sense with child molesters that they have any sort of empathy for their victims?
It's an interesting question. They run the whole gamut. There do exist very, very heinous offenders where paedophilia is not the only thing that's unusual with them. They also either have antisocial personality disorder or a particularly severe type of it called psychopathy. Those are people who, in addition to being pedophilic, really do not care whatsoever about what happens to anybody else or victims or animals. So the combination of pedophilia and psychopathy, that's what produces the horrid, horrid cases that we see in the newspapers. The majority, however, are regular, everyday people. A large chunk of them are aware of their pedophilia, do their best to suppress it. They try to get help for it when they can, and they do the best that they can to lead a celibate life. Then there are also people who are aware of their sexual interest in children, but fool themselves. They talk themselves into, well, it's not such a bad idea. Well, maybe this particular kid is more developed, and oh, that kind of looks like flirting to me. And they slowly talk themselves into believing that the interaction that they're having with whatever kid is a relatively mutual interaction. So, as I say, there's a range of people who are very pro-social and know that they have to control themselves, to the ones who really kind of convince themselves to hear what it is they want to hear, to the other extreme, people who really do not care if what they do does any harm to anyone else.
The impact on people's lives who've been victims of pedophilic behaviour is devastating. It ruins people's lives. So from what we now know about the brains of people with these tendencies, how responsible should pedophiles be for their own behaviour?
That's an excellent question. The research is now pretty solid in saying that these people are not responsible for their sexual interests. In the same way that somebody doesn't ask to be gay or ask to be straight, nobody asks to be a pedophile. Rather, they realize over the course of life what they're attracted to. They are, however, still responsible for their behavior. There's nothing in any of my research or any of the other researchers' results that suggests that these people are any less able to control what they're actually doing. Pedophilia seems to be just about what it is that starts their sexual arousal system, but they seem to be still just as capable of controlling what they do with that arousal as everybody else.
James Cantor. Along with his research into pedophilia, Stephen Smallbone has treated hundreds of sex offenders. He emphasises that this is not an homogenous group of people, so there should not be just one single treatment. And it's well recognised in the field of rehabilitation that the best approach is to focus on the highest risk offenders with the highest intensity interventions.
The evidence suggests that for adult sex offenders, the most effective treatments are cognitive behavioural treatments and pharmacological treatments. So in some particularly extreme cases for highly persistent offenders, medications can be very effective, but very few people, I think, would argue that should be applied across the board. In terms of the effectiveness, and we're talking here for adults, there are different kinds of treatments that are found to be particularly effective with youth sex offenders. But for adults, the evidence suggests that over a period of around 4 to 6 years after a release from prison, for example, good quality treatments can reduce recidivism, sexual recidivism rates. This is by, well, from around 16 to 17% down to about 12 or 11%. It doesn't sound much, but that's more or less a 30% reduction from the baseline.
And so what direction does new research have to take, in your opinion?
Certainly in our group at Griffith University, we've really tried to focus on understanding how these abuse incidents occur for the very first time. So we've talked a little bit about treatment of offenders, but that's the back end, of the problem. The damage is already done. And there's all sorts of uncertainty about which offenders should be allocated the very expensive kinds of rehabilitation resources that are available. It seems to me much more sensible to be thinking about and organising public policy around how might we prevent abuse from occurring in the first place. So I think from a research point of view, there needs to be a major redirection of efforts to understand that.
Professor Stephen Smallbone from the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University in Queensland. In some senses, it feels quite strange to be talking about this issue in such, I guess, scientific terms because of the incredible impact that it can have on victims. What experience have you had with victims and their families, and how has that influenced your work and your research?
That's very interesting. People ask that a lot. It's not inhuman, it's simply necessary in order for us to focus on the particular pieces that we need to focus on, because if we focus on the emotional part, we can't help anyone. Most of it is really coming to see people who were pedophilic as people first. They didn't ask to be pedophilic. They very often were abused themselves, or they were in situations where they felt coerced into different kinds of sexual situations. So even though in my clinic we deal mostly with the perpetrators, just being a psychologist, it's inescapable to work closely with people who are also victims of abuse. But really what it boils down to is the reward for keeping our emotions down and forming a bond with someone who has trouble forming bonds with anyone is that we can actually help this person never to commit another offense. And that's a pretty high reward, and it makes it worth trying to damp down or keep a control on our own emotions.
James Cantor, Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. And the last word from Anthony Foster. So what are your thoughts and reactions to the Royal Commission into Child Abuse, which has recently begun?
So much as we're looking for justice for our children, we are also looking for justice for the much, much wider body of victims that have been affected by Catholic Church and other institutional abuse. And we need to be sure that our laws prevent these sort of things happening in the future. And that's the hope that we continue on with.
The Fosters' disturbing but brave account of their family's experience is documented in the book Hell on the Way to Heaven by Chrissy Foster with Paul Kennedy. If today's program has raised difficult emotions for you, call the Lifeline helpline on 131114. That's 131114. That and other details about the program will be on the All in the Mind website from abc.net.au/Radio National. Today's sound engineer is Louis Mitchell. I'm Lynn Malcolm. Thanks for your company, and do join me next week. Now on RN.
Well, there you go. So ends part 2 of the psychology of paedophilia, brought to us by ABC Radio National's All in the Mind program. And I stress for my overseas viewers, that phone number's only going to work in Australia. I have no idea what the Lifeline number is everywhere else on the planet. Warbles, oddle at the YouTube. Ciao.